Well, welcome to day two. We have a very special day planned for you today, and this is really the good stuff here. So it is my pleasure to welcome, we're going to go right out the gates with an awesome first session with one of the best women's suffrage historians out there. I thought about doing a stuffy intro, but that just seems wrong with doing it with Dr. Carol Busey. However, I should let you know, for those that don't know her, she is a fabulous historian here in the state of Tennessee. She is a doctorate of history, and she is professor at Volunteer State Community College. She is probably one of the biggest advocates in the university realm for teachers in Tennessee. She's written multiple textbooks for teachers. You may know Tennessee Through Time, the later years, the early years, both volumes. Dr. Busey wrote those, and she is just as much a friend as she is a wonderful academic scholar with women's suffrage. So it is my pleasure to now welcome to the stage Dr. Carol Busey to give us our talk on women's suffrage.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a great pleasure to work with Kira, Jeff, Kelly, Casey, Jennifer, all of these people. We've worked together on so many projects now. We really, I think, have come to know each other quite well. Now, for you teachers, I am thrilled that you all are willing to give up your summer time and participate in this workshop. And here are my pointers about teaching history. Students come into my classes and say, oh, I was never good with dates. I don't like to memorize things. And I keep telling my students, and I want to tell you this too, I think most of you know this, history is just a story. And it's the bigger picture of U.S. history is thousands and thousands of stories. And the stories are not just presidents and generals. There are people like your grandmother, my grandmother. There are people who came here as enslaved people. There are descendants of people who lost their lands and were pushed west and ultimately put on reservations. History is lots of stories. And one of the best ones in Tennessee history is the story about how women got the right to vote. Now, you know, it's hard to believe when we have a Declaration of Independence, the thing on which our country was really founded, that, is my screen share up? Share.
Yes, Carol is just sharing.
Okay, good. You can see it. Okay. Yeah. It's hard to believe that when our country was founded with the immortal words of the Declaration of Independence, that women could not vote. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Now, let me make it clear that they certainly never meant all men. They didn't even mean all white men. What they meant was we're not going to have royalty in this new country or 13 little countries as they thought they might have. We are going to have equality. There will be no dukes, no earls, no royalty. We are creating a new idea, a new view of government where all people are equal, at least in the eyes of God, and no ranking of citizens according to who their parents were. And so here, this is where this idea began, but certainly, as you well know, it did not really include very many people. And so over the years, we began adding people, expanding who could participate in government. And that really meant including women African Americans, Native Americans, but it has taken us a long, long time to get that far down the road. Now, one of the reasons that women have been ignored in history is because women's work is just not like men. Men are climbing the ladder of success, and women work communally. They come together, whether it's the birthing of a baby, the single most dangerous and life-threatening thing a person in the colonies and the early United States history could do. They came together to work on projects. They talked, and ultimately they talked about problems that society had. Suffrage began in the anti-slavery movement, and I'm sure you've heard the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott being excluded from an international suffrage conference because they were women. And so they went and called a women's rights meeting to talk about women's rights. It took 8 years for that to take place, but it took place in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And when that took place, out of that came the Seneca Falls resolutions, the most controversial of which was women should be able to vote. And yet that was the thing that really, really they ultimately committed their lives to. Stanton, Susan B. Anthony joins them later, a whole host of people. Now, as you know, if woman suffrage grew out of anti-slavery, you understand that in the South, after the Civil War, Southerners were going to have nothing to do with woman suffrage because they tied it so closely to anti-slavery. And Southerners pretty quickly, once they redeemed their states and the ex-Confederates came back into power, they retold the story of the Civil War so that it came up with this myth of the lost cause and this idea that the Civil War was not about slavery at all, but was about states' rights. But go back and read all the secession documents, read the constitutions of those states that seceded. What right did they want to protect? They wanted to protect their right to own other people. Now, another point I want to make, I've got about 6 big points here I want to make. We really mistell the story when we boil it down to 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or 4 people. Women work communally. I emphasize this. So it was the work of hundreds and hundreds of nameless women in Tennessee that got woman suffrage going here in the very late 19th century and early 20th century. Some of these names over the past 25 years, such as Abby Crawford Milton and Catherine Kinney, have become more familiar to some teachers, and they're included in some versions of the story, but not all. Rarely are Frankie Pierce and Maddie Coleman included in the stories. Here are 2 African-American women. They wanted the right to vote too. They were eager to use the vote to help African-Americans. Here is Ann Dallas Dudley with her 2 children. She was certainly the face of the movement simply because a picture like this could not threaten men. You have Kate Birch Warner there in the center of that slide, who became the president of the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association, brought the group together and led us to 1920. You also see Margaret Irvin Ford, who was from Lookout Mountain. She also was very, very active in this movement. Names that you probably don't know are Della Dortch, or Betty Donaldson, or Maria Thompson Davies. Maria Thompson Davies, I like to say, was the Danielle Steele of her era. She wrote all of these syrupy romance novels, and she ultimately lived in New York. She was a good friend of Ann Dallas Dudley. She taught at Belmont at Ward Belmont for a while. Very interesting people. So I want to encourage you, I want to challenge you to find the suffragists in the attic of whatever county, whatever school district you teach in. I want you to look for the suffragists in your attic, because I guarantee they are there. Now, the suffragists have a lot of different opinions within their ranks about how to go about achieving their goal. It was a singular-minded, singularly focused organizations. Sue Shelton White and Margaret Hayes Powell were both of the activism mind. They thought we need to go out and do something very physical and very actively to get the president and the governor and all the lawmakers' attention. So Sue Shelton White was one of those suffragists who ultimately went with Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party. Margaret Hayes Powell, who grew up in Williamson County, moved into East Tennessee. For those of you who might have gone to East Tennessee State, there is a dorm named for Margaret Hayes Powell on the campus, and just a delicious little morsel. It is, as I understand it, a male dorm now. Margaret Hayes Powell, though, for those of you who teach in Davidson County, she is the grandmother of, hold on to your hat, folks, the mayor of Nashville, John Cooper, and Congressman Jim Cooper. And she is largely unknown, but last year I was at a gathering with Mayor Cooper, who was running for office at the time, and I had talked about women going to movie theaters and giving lectures before the silent movies began. And he came up to me and he said, well, that explains it. My grandmother did that all the time in East Tennessee. And so you couldn't really go address a church congregation. Some of the most vocal opponents of suffrage came from preachers. They were very concerned about the patriarchy. They felt that suffrage for women was not ordained by God. Now, something I think that bears repeating, although I'm sure every one of you nearly know this, we don't call the American women who wanted the right to vote suffragettes. They are suffragists, and that was by their choice. The British women called themselves suffragettes because a reporter had initially used that term, but the American women call themselves suffragists. And yet over and over, I pick up newspaper articles and they're referring to the suffragette anniversary or something of that nature. But American women, look at their correspondence, they always call themselves suffragists. And this word, as Elaine Weiss, who has this very fine book, The Woman's Hour, pointed out, it means a prayer, a supplication, an intercessory prayer. When you have an intercessory prayer, you are asking for something on the behalf of others, for the sick, for the bereaved. And a vote is like an intercessory prayer. Suffrage is like an intercessory prayer. Now, the Tennessee women got very well organized about at the beginning of 1900. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was the Goliath of all. I shouldn't call them Goliath, that's a male term. It was the largest of all the women's voluntary associations in the United States. It was a remarkable organization, and it actually had a multiple agenda of lots and lots. It had 30 or 40 departments. And so one of the departments was a department on woman suffrage here in Nashville, but that suffrage union in East Nashville had to close that department down because it was so controversial. At their 1907 convention, the WCTU added a plank in support of woman suffrage, and it was so inflammatory here in Tennessee where they did it that the president of the state WCTU had to issue a letter to all the newspapers to print saying that that was not the opinion of the Tennessee WCTU. Now, the WCTU, Chris, you'll find this interesting, was going to have one of their state conventions in Clarksville. And they normally met in churches, but they could not find a preacher in Clarksville who would allow them to use his church unless they allowed him to speak against woman suffrage. So guess where the resourceful WCTU met in Clarksville? A synagogue. And that was quite a remarkable thing, that the ministers, if they were going to welcome the WCTU to their meeting, they wanted to be sure and say a word against women voting. Now, the Tennessee women had several ways that they could get the right to vote. One was an amendment to the state constitution. The Constitution of 1870 said that specifically restricted the vote because they were so concerned about African Americans voting. And so they attempted to do that, but that Constitution had been written in such a way as to make sure the ex-Confederates never lost political power again, that you had to get an amendment approved by 2 different sessions of the General Assembly. That means it takes about 4 years before it can even go to the people to be voted on. So Tennessee's Constitution never got amended. So failing at that, in 1919, they decided to go for something, and that was partial suffrage. Now, by partial suffrage, they could get the legislature to pass a bill saying that women in Tennessee have the right to vote in local elections in your own county, your own town, your own city, and you have the right to vote for presidential electors. But in order to give women the right to vote in statewide elections, either the state constitution had to be amended or the national constitution had to be amended. But Tennessee women were cheering in 1919 that they had gotten the right to vote at least for presidential electors and in local elections. Mary Cordelia Beasley Hudson from Camden over there on the Tennessee River is thought to be probably among the first women who voted, because there was a special election right after that bill was passed, and she voted in that special election. We also think that Margaret Irvin Ford in Lookout Mountain was among the very first women to vote. But voting wasn't a simple matter of showing up at the polling place and voting, because you had to be registered and you had to pay a poll tax. Now, where does this phrase, the perfect 36, come from? We've always thought that this was a cutesy way to refer to women's bodies. As the story has been told on several occasions, Anne Dallas Dudley, who was quite an attractive young woman, that was a description of a woman's perfect body, 36, 22, 36. But that's not where it came from at all. Actually, it was a silent movie with a film star, Mabel Norman, who was a vamp, and she does all these gymnastic tricks, and she was the perfect 36. In 1919, it was playing here in Nashville at the Vendome Theater. But the Nashville women, the Tennessee women, never thought Tennessee men would ratify an amendment to the Constitution, even though right about the time that this movie's playing in 1919, Congress, the House and the Senate of the United States finally passed the amendment to send it on out to the people to vote. And in that summer, some of the states up in the Midwest ratified it very, very rapidly. But we move into 1920 and it gets slower and slower. And again, Carrie Chapman Catt, the national leader, Alice Paul, the leader of the Woman's Party, And the Southern women themselves thought this amendment to the Constitution doesn't have a chance. And yet, as we get down to March, when Washington State became the 35th, there's no other states. The governors are going to have to call special sessions. So by the time we get down to the summer, it's really down to 2 states, North Carolina and Tennessee. Both governors were going to have to call special sessions, and both governors hoped the other one would, so that their state would not have to do it and have this, what they saw was going to be a major fight over this. So the Tennessee suffragists are enthusiastic about voting. They think it's inevitable, but they're not thinking about Tennessee being the 36th and deciding state. What they want to do is get ready for when we get to vote. So they, at the suggestion of Carrie Chapman Catt, the National Suffrage Association becomes the League of Women Voters, preparing women. Now, it is not until this special session gets called by Governor Albert Roberts, very nervous because he was running for re-election that year, that the antis really mobilize. Josephine Pearson is the face of the antis, but there was really no significant anti-suffrage movement in Tennessee at all until about 1914, when the suffragists first mentioned the constitutional amendment to the Tennessee Constitution. John J. Vertrees, who had been very much opposed to prohibition, in other words, he was against the WCTU, he very quickly was very much against woman suffrage. So his wife becomes the head of the Tennessee anti-suffrage movement. She gets very ill and dies, and they handpick Miss Josephine Pearson, who had taught at a girls' academy in Nashville for a while, as the leader of the antis. So when it becomes evident that this special session is going to come into play, the antis go to work. Miss Pearson comes back to Nashville. This is the picture you are most familiar with, seeing her. And I want to draw your attention especially to this picture because you see that Confederate flag. Miss Pearson devoted the rest of her life after 1920 to perpetuating the story of the lost cause. She had promised this to her mother, and she was very much wrapped up in this. So look at the racial dimensions as you tell this story. The antis in their headquarters there at the Hermitage Hotel had a museum exhibit about women's suffrage, and it was terribly racially motivated. You have pictures with Susan B. Anthony and Booker T. Washington. You have all manner of highly racist material, and they wanted to emphasize the issue of race. So here come the special session members of our state legislature in. Again, we simplify the story and emphasize the role of Harry T. Byrne and his mother. And it is a wonderful story. I love reading parts of that letter to my students. Be a good boy. Help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. Harry Byrne is a hero. He is a major hero, but he is one of many. So look at the votes of the legislators from your counties and see if they voted for it or if they voted against it. It's pretty interesting to check that out. She sent this letter to her son. Can you imagine sending a letter like this today? This is over in Knoxville at the McClung Collection. It was just addressed to her son at the state capitol, and it was delivered to him that morning. Now, there were several different votes here. Again, we've simplified this story over and over again. First, the Senate passed it, and then it was down to the House. then a House committee had to send it out of committee to the full House. And in that House committee vote, Banks Turner, who was from Gibson County over in West Tennessee, was very nervous about what he was going to do. So the amendment is sent without Banks Turner's real support to the next day, which is the 18th, to the floor of the House, where when the speaker, who has stepped down from the podium, says, I want to say a few words before we begin voting. First of all, I would like to move that we table the amendment. Now, tabling the amendment just means putting it away, not voting at all. Therefore, you can go back to your constituents without having to say, I voted for it, or going back to your constituents and saying, I voted against it. And the pressure was really on because news arrived in Nashville that morning that the word had come from North Carolina, that North Carolina's legislature had tabled it. So it is do or die. And Banks Turner votes not to table the amendment. And then we have the roll call for the vote. And here is the name of young Harry T. Byrne with that precious letter in his pocket. And he votes no. So instead of he votes yes, I support women's suffrage. If he had voted no, the vote would have been tied 48 to 48, but now it's going to be 49 to 47. And then you get to the end of the alphabet. Banks Turner votes in favor of suffrage. The celebration begins. Their antis have effort after effort after effort to try to get the amendment recalled and voted on again, but they are not successful. And after about a week of legislative and legal maneuverings to try to get the vote on suffrage, the ratification undone, Governor Roberts signs it, and it is sent by special delivery to Washington, D.C., where the Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby, signs it into law to be added to our Constitution on August 26th. 1920. And it was a remarkable achievement that it took place, not in Washington, not in New York City, but this final vote was ours right here in Tennessee. And the men did what was right, the ones who voted for it, if you support suffrage, that is, and they enabled it to happen. And so this is one of the statements that's very prominent in Elaine Weiss's book that I think I want to leave you with here today. Voting is an emblem of our equality. Women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours costs millions of dollars in the lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul, which you will never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling you to act, to make no pause, act. And so that is the story of what happened here in Tennessee and what the final battle was. There's a lot more to this story at different levels, depending on what grade you're teaching. You can go into more depth. I'm going to send Kira and Kelly and Jeff a one-page kind of list of bullet points for you that they can email you. But it's a great story, and we have made so much progress in the telling of it. So I hope that you will go down to the State Museum and when it opens and see their exhibit. It's going to be remarkable. The Nashville Public Television Station has a very fine documentary called By One Vote that premiered last November at the State Museum. It's available now for national distribution. I'm sure you'll be able to watch that in August when it is out there to be shown on your local public television station. And you can watch it live streaming as well. So take advantage of this and enjoy it. It's just one of many great stories we've got. Thank you.
Carol, thank you so much. That's great. We would all be applauding. I think we have that as an option in our reaction. So thank you. You always do such a fantastic job telling the story. We really appreciate your time today. Do teachers have any questions for Carol? If you do, go ahead and drop those into the chat. We'll take just a couple of minutes and see if we've got any questions. Janie's asking about the movie name. I know that's in the PowerPoint, Carol.
The movie name of the Perfect 36 or the public television? The public television documentary is called Ratified, and it'll be available at your local public television stations. It's already, you can link to it on the WNPT, the Nashville, Tennessee local television station. The movie that where the term the Perfect 36 came from, it was actually called the Perfect 36. It was apparently one of these silent movies, a Perfect 36.
Okay.
And it was one of these silent movies where you've got a woman in sort of what you and I would call, I don't know, sort of gym clothes, very modest by today's standards, but she does all sorts of acrobatics and dives into water and all sorts of things. And of course, it's got a little romance to it as well.
Perfect. And guys, we're going to send you all in the email that I'm going to send out, the final email with all the resources from this workshop. I've got a link to that MPT video that Carol's talking about, so you guys will get that. I know a couple of other questions have come in. Is there any truth to the story that Harry Byrne had to hide in a Nashville office building the night after the vote? Because folks were looking for him.
Well, that story has been, like a lot of other stories, slightly stretched a little bit. There's a very, very fine biography of Harry Byrne that came out last summer, that is really very comprehensive about telling that. The young man who wrote the book, it's published by the History Press. And he did a lot of research. He's got a lot of interesting characters in there from East Tennessee, as well as Middle and West Tennessee. And it really is a fine book. It's called Harry T. Byrne. I think it's Tennessee Statesman, but it really is a very well-written book. His name is Tyler Boyd. He is a high school teacher, I believe, somewhere, just like some of you anyway. He is, I believe Tyler is a high school teacher, and I saw him down at the archives the other day. He's working on a new book about a murder that took place over in East Tennessee. So he's done us a great service by putting all of this material together. But so the answer is, not really. Because he was, I think, very happy with what he did. The antis, I mean, they would not stop, not so much chasing Harry, but they had a big meeting at the Ryman. They're going to try to get some judge to get an injunction to discount the vote. It's just a huge, huge mess. And that's why I highly recommend the Elaine Weiss book. There is a lovely article called Countdown to Nashville that appeared in the 1980s. in American Heritage magazine. It has been reprinted in a volume that the University of Memphis published a few years ago. Paula Casey is the editor of that volume, and it's got some bios and a lot of interesting things in it and a lot of pictures. And the Carol Lynn Yellen article is in that. There's several articles in the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, one of which is by Anastasia Sims that tells the story. It's called Powers That Pray, P-R-A-Y, and Powers That P-R-E-Y. And so it's a really fine article, and I can send Kelly, Kira, anybody, a list of articles from the THQ about these individual suffragists, because there's an article, there are just lots of articles in there about woman suffrage. And Maria Thompson Davies, the writer, is one of the most interesting ones. She's just been totally forgotten. And there are lots more. You've got them in your county. I'm just confident you've got somebody in your county. I see, Amber, I think your little friend there wants to learn a little bit more about women voting too. I'm glad to see that.
Perfect. Thanks, Carol. And I there was a question about books, but I think we're sort of covering that because you mentioned, several resources there in that list of articles from the quarterly that we'll get out to folks. That 200 years through 200 stories. Guys, we'll try to get links to all of those out to you in the email. I'll work on that this afternoon. So you all have that. Carol, also, I think it's you that transcribed that Abby Crawford Milton oral history that is published as an article in the THQ. We've been using that a lot in our single day suffrage workshops. We love that oral history from Abby Crawford Milton. But we've got, I think, one last question from Celeste. She wanted to ask it verbally, so I'm gonna go ahead and turn things over to her and let her ask that question of you.
Hey, Celeste.
Hey, Carol, how are you?
I'm good.
Good. I teach fourth grade science and social studies in East Tennessee, and every year I like to do a living history museum. I try to use our standards within my fourth grade content, and so that starts in colonization and ends up like right after the Civil War.
Wow.
So every year I end up having a bunch of girls have to dress up as a bunch of guys, which they do and make the best out of it. But is there like a good place where I could go to maybe incorporate some other women during that time period that aren't necessarily in my standards but are still important?
You mean, well, the suffragists, I can send you, I mean, their names are in a lot of these articles. There's just a lot of them. And there are a lot of East Tennessee suffragists and who, well, they're kind of their leader was Lizzie Crozier French, but there were a whole lot of women in East Tennessee who supported suffrage and, women's clubs. Every county had some women's clubs. By 1920, churches had church circles, which were really voluntary associations. Women had book clubs, study clubs. So where do you teach? Where do you live?
I have a Kingsport address, so I teach in Sullivan County at Indian Springs Elementary.
Okay, well, Kingsport was a very young place in 1920. Its history is kind of unique, but you should be able to find some women from East Tennessee who, even if they went off to a foreign mission field, if they were sent by a church, I think those were pretty brave and remarkable women. But I'm sure you got lots of WCTU ladies in your closets up there in East Tennessee.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks, Celeste. And again, Carol, thank you so much for your time today. You always do such a great job telling the story. I know teachers really appreciated that. You are welcome, Carol, to stick around. I think we're going to start working towards our next activity with Jennifer. Jennifer's going to talk about Ida B. Wells for a little bit, do a little presentation on her. So you are welcome to stick around. But you know, we'll certainly be in touch. And again, thank you so much for your time today. I know everybody has appreciated that.
My pleasure. And, you know, Kelly, I didn't put this on a slide, but Kelly and everybody who's organizing this knows how to find me. And I'm happy to take emails from you. It's hard for me to return phone calls, but it's fairly easy to answer questions in email. So if anytime you want to email me, I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, and we've also had a couple of questions about sharing the PowerPoint. Would you mind doing that, Carol?
Well, I tell you what, if I can get enough time this afternoon to go in here and put the sources of the pictures on there, I would be glad for you to have it. But I get very nervous when I go global and
Okay.
I don't have credits for my photos.
Absolutely.
It's legal for educational purposes, but yes, I would be delighted to share it with y'all. But I probably need to put a few IDs on some of these photos.
We absolutely.
Many of which came from TSLA.
I know. We absolutely understand that and appreciate that from the archives. We love it when folks credit those collections. So again, thanks, Carol. You were fantastic.
My pleasure. I love doing it. Y'all do a great job. And if I were in charge of the world, every one of you would get your salary doubled.
Yay!
It's the hardest job in America to be an elementary, middle school, or high school teacher, and people don't get it. That's all I've got to say.
All right. Guys, thanks for coming back. We're kind of working our way towards our last activity. So I'm going to turn things over to Kira and Stacy to lead us through our panel discussion.
So we are really excited to have with us today Dr. Nancy Schur and Dr. Mary Evans. Unfortunately, our third panelist, Dr. K.T. Ewing, was not able to join us today. So we appreciate Dr. Schur and Dr. Evans taking on expanded roles for this panel discussion. What we're planning to do here is we're going to give each of them a few minutes at the beginning to make some remarks, to kind of talk about a few things that maybe we haven't referenced and brought up during the course of these 2 days. And then we're going to have about 30 minutes after their brief remarks for questions from you guys. So as they are talking, if you have questions about the topics that they're speaking on, feel free to put those in the chat box. Stacy and I are going to be monitoring that to bring those back up to them. And then we'll also have a chance, if you have questions that you would like to verbally ask them, we'll call on a few of you guys to do that for the second half of the panel discussion. So we're going to start with Dr. Nancy Schur. She is an associate professor of history at Chattanooga State Community College. And for those of you who may have participated in workshops with us or with the workshops that the East Tennessee Historical Society does, you may be familiar with her. She's been working with teachers in the education program there with Lisa for a number of years. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Schur to talk to us about Mary Church Tyrell.
Thank you, Kira. Hello, everyone. I hope you've been having a good conference. I've been popping into several of the sessions, both yesterday and today, and man, what a bunch of great information and resources you all are getting. When I think about the women's suffrage movement in the United States, it always blows my mind that it is a good, solid 4 generations of leadership that it takes, 4 generations of activists that it takes to win that vote for the 19th Amendment. And if you think about it, I was reading through this little book I got. I think Lisa Oakley gave this to me a couple years ago. It's called The Perfect 36. And it's a book just all about what happens in Tennessee during this time period. And in the introduction of this book, it lays out the timeline like this. It says, In 1848, which you all looked at the Seneca Falls Convention yesterday, in 1848, the Declaration of Independence was 72 years old. In 1848, it took 72 more years for the 19th Amendment to be ratified. That is mind-blowing. And so what I like to always talk about with my students when we're thinking about and learning about suffrage, particularly in Tennessee, but in whatever context, is that the perspective of this is very long, right? And we have different women at different times that are making contributions to the effort. And one of the woman I want to talk with you about today is a woman of color named Mary Church Tyrell. And just to give you a little bit of a background, she is a contemporary of Ada B. Wells. I think you learned about Ada B. Wells earlier today. I caught a little bit of that session, which was great. As you may know, Ada B. Wells was born in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi, very close to Memphis. Mary Church, later Mary Church Tyrell, when she marries, is born in 1863 in Memphis. And so these two are contemporaries, and they work closely together in trying to not only solve the suffrage problem, but also solve the racial inequalities that are taking place in their world. And so we have a woman in Mary Church Tyrell who's born during slavery in 1863, who lives through the post-Civil War period, through Reconstruction, who lives through the Jim Crow laws and era in the South, who lives through the Gilded Age, who lives through the Progressive Movement, who lives through World War I, through the Great Depression, through World War II, and starts some of the earliest sit-in protests in the modern civil rights movement in 1950. And she lives to see the Brown versus Board of Education decision come down in 1954, 2 months before her death. And so if we're thinking about a perspective on this civil rights movement, Mary Church Tyrell is an awesome example. You might have heard this term, a race woman. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds today, but in my classes, I like to sort of help students understand that there are roles and expectations for women of this era. And you might have heard of the true woman, right? This woman who in the 19th century is an early 20th century, she's a homemaker, right? She's all about family and home and hearthstone. Well, to be a true woman in the African-American community, it was to be a race woman. And much different from the stay-at-home mother, household person. A race woman was an activist. She was highly educated, and she was a spokesperson for her race and for equality. And there is no other quintessential race woman than Mary Church Tyrell. For one thing, her parents emphasized and facilitated a world-class education for her. Her parents did not think that Memphis city schools were adequate for their child. And so when she was 7 years old, imagine this, at 7 years old, she went to Antioch College for her for her elementary school and for her high school. Antioch College is still located in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And then she began her college career at Oberlin College. That is a college, that is the first college in the United States that was open to both female and African-American students. And to make a long story short, she matriculated all the way through a master's degree in education, and she was hired to eventually be a superintendent at the Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. And it's through her educational background that she jumps into activism. When she's about 22 years old, she begins to really devote a lot of her time to racial equality, to anti-lynching. She collaborates with Ida B. Wells in an anti-lynching campaign. She collaborates with Frederick Douglass in an equality campaign, and she really becomes an outspoken person, advocate for the women, for the right for women to vote. I feel like I'm just listing off her bona fides, right? Her accomplishments, but she took a 2-year sabbatical and toured Europe, where she learned 3 different languages. She was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women. And I don't know if y'all have delved too deeply into this Black Women's Club movement, but the National Association of Colored Women, their motto was "Lifting as we climb." And if you think about that motto and what that motto might mean, lifting as we climb, right? These women have the idea of uplifting their race as the entire race is trying to climb towards equality. And so I'm always really keen on having students, sort of consider what that motto, "Lifting as we climb," stands for. And the National Association of Colored Women is an organization that tries to engage women outside of their religious communities to work for equality and to help their fellow man and women. In particular, they're fierce advocates of making sure that working African American women have a place for their kids to go while they're at work. And so if they are pre-school age, the NACW helps provide kindergartens and daycares to facilitate the working lives of their community members. And if I can fast forward to her suffrage movement, Mary Church Terrell's suffrage activism. At one point, she decides that she wants to do more, right? She has been an educationalist for a number of years, and she wants to be a full-time dedicated activist for racial equality. And in 1950, she started the first successful sit-in in the District of Columbia restaurants. In DC, in 1950, it was still segregated. Obviously, this is before the Brown decision that will desegregate schools. And she and a bunch of students protest nonviolently. They sit in restaurants to try and force the clientele to try and integrate the restaurants. And also what she does is something that's called a buy-in, where she buys all the tickets to the downtown theater and distributes them to members of the African American community in the district. And so sort of forces the owner to decide whether he wants the proceeds for that ticket sale for the night, and he can allow African American clientele in, or whether he wants to lose the money. And so these are really pioneering actions that Mary Church Terrell takes. Her leadership was just absolutely critical to the early civil rights movement. And I just wanted to introduce you to her a little bit more. And thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. So Stacy, I think, is going to introduce Dr. Evans for us.
Yes, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Mary Evans, a colleague of mine. She is a research associate professor at MTSU. She teaches in the history department and the honors college, and she is coordinator of MTSU's chapter of the American Democracy Project, which is affiliated with the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. And she's been doing a lot of research lately on the progressive era and women as agents of political and social change. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Evans.
All right, hey, I'm writing down my time here so I can see where we are and kind of keep track of it. So, hey, everybody, good morning. Thanks to Stacy and Kira for sweet introduction, welcoming me and inviting me to be part of this today. And also, I guess I really want to take the time to express, and you all probably did either yesterday or today, about the passing of our esteemed colleague, Dr. Revis Mitchell, over at Fisk. So that's why Dr. Ewing is not able to be here today. So thanks to Dr. Schur, and she and I are pushing on with this the best we can without that additional support. So from my little humble home office to yours, good morning to everybody. And if it's all right with Stacy and Kira, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. So we'll see how I pull this off. Just give me one.
Go right ahead. You should have the, should let you do that.
Okay. All right. Then I'm going to go on. There we go. So, all right, everybody. Are we good? I think, does this work on your end, Kira? No adjustments?
Yeah, we can see you.
All righty. Okay. About in January is when Kira got in touch with me asking me to be a part of this whole series here for TPS, and then just really started breaking down what we were going to talk about. So in thinking about my subject matter and my assignment, which was women's civic work, I kind of came up with what I thought my objectives were to cover today. Sort of to talk to you about the portals that shifted women into the public sphere, such as church groups and women's clubs and teaching, nursing, and various other kinds of work that took place outside of the home, and to set those as and define those as empowerment and political action. And in the process, to obviously be talking about civic work in terms of defining that as what we do for the community, and maybe attempting in the process to broaden our definition of politics, because those of us who work in women's history certainly know that politics is a very gendered term, and especially in this day and time, if we want to make it relevant for our students, being able to present this subject matter as non-gendered and as sort of all-encompassing in terms of agency, not only for women back 100 years ago, but for our students now, our young folks, and whether they be freshmen in my classes at MTSU or the students that you're getting in middle school and high school, the politics in which they can engage is powerful and real, and all of these issues that have to do with social movement across time should be really relevant and important to them. And in just historically stepping back, then the context of all this is to discuss how the work that women did in those 5 areas that were at the top really positioned them to be ready to move forward nationally, but certainly here in Tennessee as well. And maybe we know the very fine narrative of the Perfect 36, as Dr. Carol Busey talked about it this morning, but we know it more broadly in terms of all the ways in which women were engaged. So let me actually take that same list and reorder it and think how I want to present it to you today. So when I talk about the concept that politics is gendered, this is not a new idea, and frankly, it probably is not a new idea from 100 years ago, but I can surely tell you that in the course of my lifetime, being in college in the 1970s, which is when the core of the women's movement was taking place, that there was much discussion about what politics is. We all know that the phraseology that politics is local is relevant. That's certainly true in women's work as well. The very basis of women's history and women's studies since the 1970s has been about the fact that we have to really look at so many aspects of the history around us as being being political, really as defining it that. And I say that because I've been a history teacher in middle school and high school myself, and now at the university level. And the way in which our history books used to be structured is politics was very great man focused. It was very presidential sequence of presidents focused. It was on military battles and wars. And, that was the way things tended to operate. But beginning in the 1970s, that began to break down enormously. And what the sort of male gendered view of politics and history began to shift over to what was pejoratively referred to sometimes as social history. But I would like to argue and posit that all of history is social history, and that the very nature of having all the voices included in our discussion of anything historic is absolutely mandatory. This is not politicized. It's rethinking how we structure it and why it's so important to do that. And that the work that women engaged in very much was civic work for the benefit of others. And what it was doing in the process was empowering them and giving them voice and allowing them to exercise their voice in the public sphere, beginning, if you will, certainly before this, but we want to say Seneca Falls in 1848 was a pretty nice starting point to sort of begin to envision that. But the truth is women were doing it all along, and that level of empowerment and political action and engagement in the public sphere is what really moved women forward through exercising that over the course of the 19th century to position them to be ready to be agents of change by the 20th century. And that same process, again, I would say is parallel to what we really want our students to experience and exist and understand and be a part of. And in our history classes, in our schools, are just the perfect place to hear, not only provide the historic background, but to hear what students' interests are and to push those forward. So looking at specifically the experiences from which women's agency and civic action emerged, I'm sort of focusing on that particular bullet point to really say that it began for women in the 1800s with church groups and Bible societies and missionary societies. It differed, of course, across every religious denomination. And certain groups, such as the Methodists, engaged in missionary societies pretty early on, but women started gathering sometimes, to read the Bible or discuss their lesson. But it began to be sort of, how can we take the Lord's work into communities? And whereas supporting missionaries and supporting work in geographical areas of the United States that needed a new church founded or a building to be built, or raising money within one's local community to, fix the roof in your home congregation. Those were some of the initial actions of women, but they began to move more and more into defining what problems were and problem solving and moving that work sometimes out of their denomination, out of their specific church group, into larger groups in which they were doing it. And that often meant caring for the widows and orphans in their home community and caring for the elderly in their church, but then moving that more forcefully into the community. And protections for young women, providing support for young women who might have gotten pregnant out of wedlock. These were all ways in which the ladies' church groups really started taking on social problems within society. And then sort of a lot of those early gatherings of women and by women moved them to social clubs that were more expressly as such. I can think about sometimes the women's church groups started as, moved as its next level into sewing circles. So the women would get together to discuss their church issues, but they would be sewing for a benefit for some purpose. Again, maybe clothing for needy families, or doing some of their own tatting or embroidery or needlepoint, but taking on study issues. And there's so many incredible examples of women's clubs kind of sort of essentially throwing up their hands and saying, you know, we got bigger issues here that we need to talk about. The Ossory Circle in Knoxville, for the women who had really started as a sort of a literary society, if you will, began taking on much more aggressive political issues, including suffrage. And that was obviously closer as we get into the 19 teens. But just bear in mind that these club groups were really important for that. And there was an emergence of women's clubs in the latter part of the 1800s. Dr. Scher referenced the National Association of Colored Women, which was formed in about 1895. Movement of women creating the National Congress of Mothers, which is the precursor to our own present day parent-teacher association, parent-teachers organizations, came out of women getting together and how can they move into being educators, which then moves me down into the next bullet, which is the fact that women's natural area was in sort of nurturing, and it was considered perfectly fine, of course, for women to nurture their children in the home. I think maybe now in the present day, we look back on women in teaching, women in public education around Tennessee, for instance, as having been something that women always did. But I need to stress the point that that was absolutely not true. The 19th century in the United States, and well, the 19th century after the Civil War in Tennessee, was dominated by schoolmasters who were men. And men dominated education in Tennessee in the latter part of the 1800s. For those who've studied the history of education in Tennessee, it was somewhere in the range of about 1901, 1909, 1903, just in that sort of little 2 or 3 year period of time, when the sheer numbers of women as teachers in school systems began to shift, and there began to be more women in men than men in education in Tennessee. But that was, that was really late in coming. So we see an increasing number of women teachers who were being paid. Now, of course, women always did it in the home, which is where that emanated from. And I need to really point out, it was white women, but it was Black women, absolutely. In the same way Dr. Scher talked about Mary Church Tyrell, Black women educators were involved in lifting while they climbed. They were involved in being teachers across Tennessee's rural school systems. They were having to be involved in, because they were well-educated African-American women, they were having to be exemplars of propriety, sort of the politics of respectability that Black women teachers had to take on to represent their community within broader society. And white women were educators. Bear in mind, this was absolutely a segregated system in those days, but women were, again, advancing within education and taking education out into the communities. There were women who were doing home demonstration clubs and being agents for agricultural education within rural communities, and women were moving into administration. So all of these are areas in which women were advancing professionally, and in the course of which they were learning their voices, expressing those in public, and beginning to address and take on increasing numbers of public issues. Another area in which women were doing education was in settlement work. And I don't know if you're familiar with that term. We usually think of settlement houses maybe in northern cities, but as in Hull House in Chicago and the Henry Street Settlement House in New York City, to deal with immigrant issues. But we had settlement houses in Tennessee, and they were some examples of interracial work, sort of what we would have defined as inner city settlements in in Tennessee and across a lot of the urban centers. And additionally, there were settlements that were made in Appalachian communities around Tennessee. Women educators were trying to help those in need and help those who needed greater uplift within their own communities or in their own regions of the state. So moving into mountainous areas, poor farming communities, Appalachian development, and again, reaching across racial lines. This was always tenuous and difficult in that era. I'm not suggesting this was common, but it did happen on occasion. It was not as rare as we might think. There were certainly always the power structures in place, so I do not wish to minimize that. But then going on to the fourth bullet, again, in the nurturing department, women were involved with nursing always and caring for the health of their families, but that starts moving out into the community. And again, these overlap with the educational and with the church and with the women's clubs organizations, supplying food to people who need it. And one of the big issues was providing milk for women who couldn't nurse, and women moving about the communities, building milk stations and trying to come up with systems to make that happen on a regular basis, and creating senior care homes for the elderly. Now, a lot of this was very embedded in political framing. There was a great push after the Civil War for wives and daughters and granddaughters of Civil War veterans to support Civil War elderly and support Civil War widows and orphans. And that moved into promoting the glorious cause and the lost cause within our schools. So a lot of the caring and nursing that came out of the United Daughters of the Confederacy moved into building buildings and doing a lot of the monuments that are very much in the news right now. And similarly, the Women's Relief Corps, which was the auxiliary of the Grand Army of the Republic. So Tennessee women who had wives and daughters of Union soldiers were trying to advance, being an American and the strength of the Union and the values that a strong United States of America stood for, to attempt to counteract a lot of that resurging glorious cause imagery that came out of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. But they, if you will, were women in both camps finding their voices and moving into the public sphere. And then also, of course, there were absolutely jobs, and women were taking on various jobs in various capacities. And certainly they were being clerks, they were being postal clerks, they were working in factories, they had many other ways in which they were holding jobs, shop girls, for instance, lots of different opportunities for women in the working world. So just to kind of move on with my outline, looking at my time here, I need to be stopping. I was going to say that a lot of you all got to hear Dr. Busey this morning, and another lecture that she gave very recently was for the Tennessee State Museum. And if you go on the Tennessee State Museum's website, you can find the link to that. Or if you go into YouTube, just Google "Working Together for the Greater Good." Dr. Busey talks about these early associations. And that's another run through in terms of a quick resource that really nails a lot of the specific Tennessee groups and women, and it's in a nice video there compiled for access. The same is true for the work of African-American women during this exact same time period. If you go into YouTube and just search, use the search function there for Tennessee women during the Civil War, Beverly Bond, Dr. Bond's lecture for the Tennessee State Museum that was just a couple of weeks ago comes up. And that's another run through for what African-American women were doing during this time period. Now, in terms of women's education, I just want to point out, because I think this may be a little bit surprising to folks, I just in fact, earlier this week, put together this map, and it's incomplete, not because the counties were incomplete, but just because my own knowledge is incomplete, and I'm absolutely working on it, of these are women's schools and seminaries and institutes and academies for women across Tennessee. Some of these schools are African-American, some of them are for white women, some of them were for men's schools that allowed women to come. But just bear in mind that there was a stunningly an enormous amount of education that was available to women you tended to be of a certain class. These schools for women came and went. They were very organic. They would form, and then the funding for them would fall apart, and the donors to those schools would disappear. So they would be united with men's schools, or as so many of them fell apart during the Civil War, but had a resurgence after the war years and moved on into the 20th century. But it is absolutely true that a lot of the women who were suffragists in this state were educated at some of these women's institutions or academies. And we might call those now, having been in the same way we're understanding that Mary Church Tyrell went to what was called Antioch College for her elementary and high school. A lot of these colleges were what we would now maybe refer to simply as high schools. But the level and quality of education in those days was pretty intense. And women who were influenced by that thinking certainly went on to influence the state of Tennessee, and in terms of the outcome and preparedness for voting. And just to give you a visual image of the changes that took place over a really short period of time, another aspect of this work is that women became needy of the physical dress in which to accomplish a lot of the objectives they wanted to work on. So clothing change in order to have mobility was relevant, but also women started moving into men's spaces, such as gymnasiums, which had definitely always been male space, but women are claiming some portion of that and learning to play basketball and learning to ride the bicycle. The bloomers associated with the bicycle phenomenon from the 1890s, all of these are really changing how women dress. And if you really look at these two pictures here from the Ward Seminary basketball team of 1898 compared to the Cumberland College basketball teams look by 1926. So, this is just a bit more than 25 years. How women are physically being represented in terms of their clothing is a mirror to how speedily they were moving into the public sphere and taking on incredibly different sorts of roles. So I tie this all into the very notion that we're in the middle of remarkable times right now. And I think for our youngest students who study history, they think it's just a matter of memorizing a list of names and dates. But in truth, what we want to try to do is absolutely tie all of that history into the contemporary moment. And here's a classic case, an example. Callie House was an African-American woman from Tennessee. She was from Rutherford County, and she went on to be one of the most enormous advocates for reparations for African-Americans. That whole notion of 40 acres and a mule that did not get to play out after the Civil War was felt by so many in the African-American community that there needed to be some financial rebalancing in order to allow African-Americans to move forward in the economic realm. And Callie House was one of those who was a washerwoman. She was not very strongly educated, but she found her voice. And Dr. Mary Frances Berry at the University of Pennsylvania has written a lot about her, as have others. But here, 100 years later, again, is a brand new book out about the call for reparations for African Americans here in the 21st century. So none of these ideas from 100 years ago is a dead notion. They're very much ones that we can bring forward to our students. And here's another one that I want to share as well. That picture in the upper left is in New York City. It is it's 1776. It is New Yorkers pulling down a statue of King George. And then on the right was what went on just earlier this week in Washington. Andrew Jackson did not get pulled down, but it was very much in the vein of an attempt to do so. And I think that all of history is so dynamic. It involves agency and activism on the streets. And our students need to understand that the dry material in our textbooks is what is important to them in their real lives today, dealing with their real lives today. So everybody knows that Tennessee is ranked 49th in terms of voter turnout, and there's much research on why this is. In fact, there's been much research on the ease of getting to the polls, and we know that low voter turnout is really no accident, that Tennessee is exceedingly lowly ranked in terms of our ability to get to the polls, and there are systemic and policy issues that are in place. And 2020 is just an incredibly pivotal, powerful year. We've got 100 years of voting for women. We've got the coronavirus, which was absolutely in play in 1918, 1919, and in 1920. The fact that it lasted for a season of 2 to 3 years is perhaps another matter of concern to us in the present day, but it was relevant to those folks 100 years ago. And any form of citizenship that women were seeking, African Americans had been seeking, African American women were seeking. This is all about agency and claiming a role in society. And we absolutely know that as the arc of the moral universe turns toward increasing justice, what that really means is that women are and citizens are placed in society to have a greater and increased role. So the more we open citizenship to Americans, to our fellow Americans, the more we have increased and moved justice forward. There's just no question about that. And I ask everybody to sort of look in terms of the historic piece that we have a new book coming out very shortly on Tennessee women in the progressive era, but this was one from a few years ago. And I've overrun my time, but would be happy to take any questions and get in touch with me if you have anything you want to talk about further.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. I'm going to start reading off a few of the questions that are appearing in the chat box. These are going to be open to both Dr. Evans and Dr. Scher. A couple of the questions we're talking about how the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement were quite connected in the 19th century, and about like how those might separate or branch off in the 20th century, how long those ties may have been maintained. And there's another question about the First World War, of course, in the early 20th century, and did that have some sort of role to play in the advancement of suffrage right afterwards, the way that World War II would in the civil rights movement later on. And there are a few other questions too. I'll get to those a little bit later. I just thought that maybe Dr. Scher, Dr. Evans, if you want to take a stab at some of those first questions.
I'll jump in on the World War I one right away, and I certainly should have referenced that. As women in Tennessee were moving forward with pushing through their various suffrage organizations that had formed in Tennessee beginning in the 1890s, and then had gone through highs and lows during the early part of the 20th century, everything sort of came to a standstill, not completely, but effectively during World War I, because women wanted to show President Woodrow Wilson that women were behind him, that they were supporting him. That was obviously true for NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And as it went on during the war, obviously the National Women's Party began to be much more activist to challenge President Wilson. But women took important roles in terms of supplying war needs, supplying our soldiers overseas. Women's clubs and women's sewing groups stepped up across Tennessee to do this work. And intriguingly, because women of the South and women of Tennessee had been so tied with the Confederacy and were still viewed askance as having been, part of the rebellion, the World War I was a wonderful time in which Tennessee women manifested that women were all American and that we in Tennessee were all behind the president. And the greater thinking by folks like Carrie Chapman Catt and others in NAWSA were that we would display our loyalty and our patriotism, which would be symbols of our citizenship, and we would therefore deserve the vote, and that it would ultimately win President Woodrow Wilson's support. And that happened. probably not necessarily through those means. It took the larger political action of the National Women's Party and struggling with picketing in front of the White House and being put in prison and then being force-fed and all that coming out that probably really turned the tide. So I'm not sure if women's manifest patriotism during the war was the way in which that power was grabbed, but World War I definitely played a role.
Dr. Scher, did you want to add to that? Any thoughts about the civil rights movement maybe and the women's suffrage movement when they split?
Yeah, I was just looking at that question here. I wanted to read it because it's a really good question from Jason. It asks, did the later 19th or 20th century suffragists maintain professional relationships with Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, and or W.E.B. Du Bois, similar to the Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony relationship? If not, when did the civil rights movement split? That is a really complicated and interesting question. The civil rights movement splits a lot. If we think about, let's just talk about the Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois. Those two intellectuals really did not play well together. Marcus Garvey, the Back to Africa movement, the African nationalism idea. W.E.B. Du Bois is livid. He writes scathing articles against Marcus Garvey, and that really, I think, is an interesting example of how, particularly if we look at the civil rights movement in its own category, right? If we think about how Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois had different ideas about fostering equality, right? You know, cast your bucket down where you are for Booker T. Washington versus a talented 10th for Marcus Garvey. And then if you sort of fast forward that into the 1960s, there's another split in civil rights activism. When we think about Malcolm X and the Black Power movement versus Martin Luther King's nonviolent civil disobedience. So we have a lot of splits in the movement, and I guess I'll throw that back out to anybody else who wants to say something.
Well, I would just reiterate what Dr. Scher said. I mean, and women moved in and out. I mean, I think perhaps the point that needs to be stressed is there was so much racial difference and hatred, and maybe that's too strong a word, but maybe it's not too strong a word. It was not good, and the women's suffrage movement is not to be lauded in terms of how it handled race throughout. I mean, both the pro-suffragists and the anti-suffragists used race issues to their benefit, and African-American women like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Tyrell and so many others jumped in and overrode that and participated even though they were not welcomed and not wanted. So race was sort of a horrible subtext to all of it, as it was throughout the course of American society. And the nastiness of the publications on pro and anti-suffrage based on race are really things that are hard to share with students, because there was such vitriol and use of blatant racism to try to advance both political objectives.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I also would just interject a little bit about sort of if we think about feminism in waves, you know, the second wave feminism, this is where African-American women really want to be separate. At least from my understanding, want to be separate from white women's organizations, because women of color don't see much of solidarity between themselves and white women. And I'm saying that obviously as a white woman. So just wanted to interject that as well.
So we have another question, and I think this is in reference to the women's academies that talks about, what happened with the funding to those. Was funding taken away from those because we were becoming too free thinking?
Oh, well, perhaps the best way to address that is just to simply say it was exceedingly complex and there's no one narrative. We have 95 counties in Tennessee, and every county basically handled its education locally. Churches were critically important. There were so many churches that started a lot of these schools. And there's a little Church of Christ, I think it was probably Disciples of Christ or Christian Church Academy, that taught women in West Tennessee, that our Tennessee suffragist Sue Shelton White attended as a girl when she grew up in Hardeman County. And there was a Methodist Women's Academy in East Tennessee, in McMinn County, that Harry Burns' mother, Phoebe M. Singer Byrne, attended when she was a girl. And then we obviously know the impact that she had on her son during the course of his life. So each of these academies was funded in a different way. And again, there would be certain donors who had girls they wanted to educate, and they would provide the funding. And when that family was alive and doing well in its business enterprise, that school got funding. If the patriarch who might have been the underwriter of that passed away, that school might have died. Meanwhile, public education was struggling to emerge through Tennessee. And again, it really took it into the 20th century for it to become somewhat more stabilized. We had dominantly log cabins that were where most of public education took place in Tennessee through the course of the 1800s. So a lot of these women's institutes and academies may have had enough funding to build a little brick building that now, for whatever institution might be on that campus now, that is like the old historic building that's in the center of it. So there was no consistent patterning for that. So if you can imagine a patchwork or a quilted patchwork of school systems and school attempts that were ever growing and dying, there's really no way to say it. We don't get systematic really until the 20th century.
We had another question about the percentage of women who voted in the first elections after 1920. Was there a particular region where there was higher women voters that turned out, and was there regions where there was a lower turnout?
Women were poor voters initially. It took almost 3 generations for women to vote. So there are a lot of sociological studies on this. I wish I had in front of me, there's a little newspaper printing from the Chicago Tribune in 1923, where folks in Chicago had attempted to go and find out, who had voted and why, and then who had not and why. And women's participation in the vote was not universal. A lot of churches preached against it, seriously preached against it, to the point that there were many places where suffrage organizations were attempting to meet, and they couldn't meet in church buildings and had to go elsewhere. But so depended on a lot of variables. And also I think the habit of voting had not been instilled within women, which is one of the reasons why in 1920 that the League of Women Voters was formed, specifically to educate women about how they needed to get involved. And the League of Women Voters was exceedingly nonpartisan. It began to educate women to get out and go to the polls. So we know that it really took about 3 generations. And I can certainly attest for my students at MTSU, I've had, as I always offer voter registration and voting as extra credit in my classes, students will come up to me and say, "Oh, I don't know about that, Dr. Evans. No women in my family have ever voted. It's not considered proper in my family." So that has, in certain pockets around the state, that has continued on into the present day. So I think certainly for those of you who are teaching these students in middle school and high school, getting the message out early on in their formative years about how important it is for every citizen to participate, that it's not a right or a privilege, it is a responsibility of being an American. And apathy is one of those things we have to continue to fight. But in terms of our early women voters, they were just so ill prepared and ill equipped to handle it initially that it took them a while to get there.
One of our other questions, did the support for women's suffrage mirror the support for slavery in the state with the kind of the three grand divisions? Was there any kind of correlation between support for slavery versus support for women's suffrage?
Nancy, you want to take that one?
I don't know the answer to that one.
I'm sure I don't know the answer either, but I can tell you this. You know that map I showed you of the schools across Tennessee and the counties where you don't see a school? It's mostly because I simply don't know about it, but they probably were there, and I'm trying to fill in those counties. You need to know that there were suffrage organizations, Tennessee Women's Suffrage League, there were suffrage organizations across the state of Tennessee in every little rural county, practically. Not every county, and that's not universally true. So, but East Tennessee women, Middle Tennessee, West Tennessee women, they were all involved in this, not only in the major cities, Knoxville, Memphis, Chattanooga, Nashville, and Jackson, but absolutely in the rural counties as well. And as if Carol mentioned this morning about the Tennessee Women's Suffragists, about the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they were almost in every single county across Tennessee. So I don't think that was the case. I think women would have been politically motivated by, you know, their family culture on which party they were voting for. But I think as suffrage emerged and as women took on the vote, that was probably equally distributed across the state, is my best guess on that, because of the nature of how suffrage really was coming out, not only the cities, but the rural counties. And we have a new master's thesis from MTSU this spring on looking at rural Tennessee suffrage associations, and they were there.
So we have just a couple minutes left. I guess my final question to the both of you, is there one point that you hope that all students kind of walk away from in their kind of formative K-12 years that they understand about the women's suffrage movement? If there was just one thing that they were going to walk away with, what would that be?
Well, I'll jump in here. If there was one thing I want students to remember about the women's suffrage movement, is that the work still goes on. We're looking at things like in Kentucky, the closed polls yesterday for the primaries. And I think I always want students to know that they can make a difference, and that they have agency. And I think inculcating the idea that, you know, sort of the democracy of this republic is not yet perfect. I think it's an ongoing sort of promise that needs to be lived up to, and that the fight isn't fully equal and fully won now.
Yeah. I totally support what Nancy had to say. Citizenship, as broadly as it can possibly be experienced across all of our citizens, is mandatory. And that we know, if we look at the women's suffrage movement, to vote is a learned behavior, and it is ongoing work. Again, I'll repeat, voting is not a right or a privilege, it's a responsibility. And citizenship is a responsibility. It's not just a given. It's a republic if we can keep it. And the work is imperative, and it's on each of our students to be involved with it. And watching those high school kids out of Florida when a couple of years ago when it came to the gun action really is a model for our students about how Tennessee students need to become involved in the life around them, the communities around them. It is civic engagement that every one of us can be involved in. The suffrage movement is just the issue that's in the front of us historically at the moment, whereby we can teach the lessons of citizenship.
Well, thank you both for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and for answering some of our questions. We really do appreciate that. So if you want to stick around, we're starting to wrap up. But again, thank you both for your time today.